very first German Auto podcast by German Auto Institute and brought to you in part by CRP Industries. CRP Industries is a company that has been the sole North American importer for such products as Continental belts and Pentosan fluids. They make oil, brake fluid, transmission fluids, I believe gear oils, power steering fluid, stuff like that. Basically, the most of the original fluids that come in German cars from the factory, Volkswagen and Audi, but also BMW, and in fact most European vehicles from the factory. I've had the pleasure of knowing the CEO of that company for a while, since we met on a business, since we met on basically on a business trip that I was sent to by one of my parts suppliers. And I got to know them very well. I discussed at the conference about some of their products they had, and they also offer a line called Rhine, which is the R in CRP, where they make an OEM quality line of cooling system components, drive axle components like CV boots and things like that. And I worked with them a little bit in the past, actually on some of their products and changing them a little bit from the way that they were made for the OEM companies. And it was just showed to me, it was just a testament of their striving for just absolute success and superiority. I mean, they really want to make sure that their products are top-notch and exceed OEM quality. And at the time, I was still running my shop, Dub Auto Works. You may be familiar with when I had the original version of this podcast. It was called the German Auto Podcast by Dub Auto Works. Shortly after I started making that podcast, I had a son born that had a birth defect, and his colon was non-functional. And so on Christmas Eve 2014, I spent 6 hours in the hospital at Seattle Children's while they removed his colon. He now has an ileostomy bag, which is the same as a colostomy bag, except that since he doesn't have a colon. And because we were looking at potentially having a lot of repeat hospital visits due to a lot of these kids getting sick with enterocolitis and things like that very often, my wife and I had to unfortunately make the decision to close my shop so we could be sure that she wouldn't end up losing her job and her health insurance, because unfortunately that's the state of affairs in America. He had over $500,000 in medical bills by the time he was 2 weeks old. It was a very scary experience, and so basically since then I've been caring for my son most of the week, and because I haven't really had the cars to work on, I hadn't made very many videos and stuff like that, but fortunately I think we're back now. Found some different things to talk about. There's some other very good podcasts and videos out there. I think mine has a space in the market. It's going to deal with a lot more of the more technical, in-depth things. And so I hope you enjoy it. Welcome all feedbacks and comments. You can comment on the video on YouTube. So the idea for German Auto Institute came about because often there's people online looking for help, asking questions in the forums, and I just saw so much misinformation and realized that basically there's a need for a place to go where you can know you're getting quality information that's correct from a professional technician without all the input, the misinformation from backyard mechanics or people that are giving really bad information to people. And so I decided to take my experience and knowledge and put it into a website, and it's gonna be membership based, but there'll be free memberships which will have things like the podcast, a lot of the videos I put out that go with the podcast, and some of the information on specific problems that are common with Volkswagens and Audis. And then there also will be a training program that basically would be a along the lines of what you would get if you were to go to community college or to automotive trade school, only it's going to be very specific information that has to do with Volkswagen and Audi. So we're going to show the fuel and ignition systems all the way back at the Volkswagen Beetle, carbureted points ignition with a distributor, their downfalls, how they were improved over time to a pointless ignition, to waste spark, to coil on plug, why those changes were made, and then same thing with the fuel and ignition, from carburation to mechanical fuel injection to port fuel injection to direct fuel injection, why those changes were made, and what improvements they brought as far as really bringing down the level of maintenance that vehicles need. A lot of times I would get people that come into my shop that would say, oh, I got my daughter or son a Beetle or a bus for their first vehicle because they had a reputation for being fairly problem-free and such. And in relation to vehicles of the time, they really were very problem-free, but what people don't realize is the changes that have been made to vehicles have made them much less maintenance prone. For example, the Beetle, you have to set the points on that thing, you might need to set them every 10,000 miles. You might need to re-gap your points. The caps and rotors wear, every 15,000 miles. You need to know how to set your valves when you do your oil changes. And most people don't have the mechanical knowledge to do those things nowadays. And if you're on a road trip and your points fry, and you don't know how to do that, and then you're stuck at some backwoods mechanic shop where, they probably have mechanics that, most of the technicians I worked with didn't know how to set points or adjust a carburetor, because it's been almost 30 years since a vehicle came with a carburetor in the United States. It's just, knowledge has been lost over time. So anyways, I hope you enjoy it, and so with that, we'll get into today's topic. So being that it's fall, it's starting to get colder out, a lot of times you'll see on the forums and on the internet, people will start talking about putting remote starts on their vehicle. Now, remote starts are really not the greatest thing in the world from a couple of standpoints. Firstly, all modern Volkswagen and Audi vehicles come with an immobilizer system, and that's been since the early 2000s. And that immobilizer system reads a chip in your key, it relays that information to the instrument cluster, and then when the engine computer starts the car up, it goes, hey, instrument cluster, is the key right? And if the key is incorrect, it shuts the fuel injectors off. So installing a remote start requires you to disable your immobilizer system, and they do that by either programming the computer, the engine computer, to ignore that immobilizer query that it sends to the instrument cluster, or they do it by taking a separate key, hiding it under the dash, and wrapping a wire around it so that it can be read when the vehicle fires up. Now, vehicles with a properly functioning immobilizer system are nearly impossible to steal. They're basically, for anybody, unless they have like a high level of technical knowledge where they know how to take the engine computer out and write an immobilizer defeat to it, someone like me, you really can't steal it. And people that have the knowledge level that a professional technician has, generally, they're not out stealing cars. So basically, the only Volkswagen and Audi with immobilizer I've ever seen stolen are when somebody's ex-girlfriend or boyfriend had the key, or they lost their key, or I saw one person accidentally leave their purse in the car with the key in it while them and their boyfriend went out on the town. The car got broken into, they found the key. But long story short, it makes the vehicle pretty near to impossible for your normal street thief to steal. Secondly, the other reason it's not great is something that's often hard to teach people. A lot of people still think that you should warm your car up. You should start it up and let it run, and that's what's best for your car. Truth is, that's really not good for your car, and the majority of automotive manufacturers recommend that you start your car up and you immediately start driving it, but you drive it easily. Now, the reason being that a lot of people don't know this, but 90% of engine wear happens on cold start. If you hook an oil pressure gauge up to your car, you'll start the car up and you'll see that oil pressure might only be hovering around 10 to 12 psi. You want in the 30s or something like that. So when the engine is hot and you're driving around, there's a pressure relief that caps it so that it doesn't get over 60 or 80 psi or something like that. generally on the oil pressure test, like say example for the 1.8 turbo, the specification calls for over 3 bar at 2,000 RPM, which is a bar is 14.7 psi, so over 36 psi at 2,000 RPM. So if you just start your car up and you let it idle, the only heat that gets put into that engine, into the coolant, into the oil, happens from burning the fuel. Now, on cold start, because there's no heat in the engine, the combustion process is very inefficient. So your engine runs more rich, much more rich than it does when you're driving. It takes a lot longer to warm up because there's no heat, or there's a lack of heat relatively to driving it, because lower RPM, less air entering the engine means less fuel entering the engine. But on top of that, there are some very specific things about the internals of the engine that most people don't know, and when you really truly understand them, it becomes clear very quickly why you don't want to do that. So we'll start it off with how the bearings and stuff function. So if you look in your owner's manual, you see there's oil recommendations. Volkswagen and Audi, unless you're in like a tropic climate, they mostly recommend oil ending in 40 weight oils, so 10W, 040, 0W, or 5W40. Now the W in that oil specification stands for winter, so it's 10 winter 40, 5 winter 40, or 0 winter 40, and that means that at cold temperatures it's 0, 5, or 10 weight, but at hot temperatures, once the oil warms up, it's 40 weight. And that's very important. A lot of people think you can just switch up your oil weight based on if you're hard on it or not. But there's actually a very important specification that has to do with, and that is the clearance between the journals on your crankshaft and the bearings on your rods, and also the main bearing rods. So this is sitting in your block. Down the center are the main bearings. They have bearings that are they're a split bearing just like this, and it holds your crankshaft in place. So these are the split bearings. They look the same. The ones that go on the main journals look the same as the one that go on the rod journals. They just either go in the block or they go on the rod. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that there's never supposed to be metal on metal contact between these bearings and either the crankshaft journal on the rods or the main journals. And the way that works is because there's a gap that has been calculated to need a specific oil viscosity by the engineers. Now, Volkswagen and Audi doesn't use a super lightweight oil, but some companies such as Ford and Honda require like a 520 or a 020 oil. And if you use the wrong weight oil, it can actually destroy your engine because the molecules in those oils are too thick to make it between the bearing and the crankshaft. So this crankshaft, and as the rods are spinning around, is always floating on a very thin layer of oil. It's actually not making contact. It's like if it's surfing on it. And these bearings are made of, these are called a tri-metal bearing. So there's 3 layers to them, and this top layer here actually does absorb or allow dirt and grit to become impacted into it, so it doesn't just score up the crank. But you need the correct weight oil, and you need it to warm up as quickly as possible, because as I said, you get 90% of your engine wear on cold start. So when you start the engine up and you take it for a drive, even if it's 20 degrees out, if you have a properly functioning thermostat, that temperature gauge should make it directly to the center of the gauge, which is about 190 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 86 to 90 degrees Celsius, and it should make it there within about a mile or 2 of driving. And if it doesn't, it generally means that your thermostat is partially stuck open, which is also bad. So what happens is, if you just sit and you idle the vehicle in your driveway, it might take 20 minutes for it to reach full operating temperature, which means 20 minutes of really not having the proper oil making it in between these bearing journals, these bearings in the journal. And if you have a turbocharger, it means the turbocharger is not being properly lubricated. So the way this works is these bearings pop into here. This is a connecting rod. The connecting rod connects to this crankshaft here, and then the piston sits at the top of it, and then it's held in place with this wrist pin here. Which I would have to hammer in, so I'm not going to do that. So anyways, as your engine starts up, this is riding on this, and it's going like this. It's going up and down, up and down. Now, the other thing that people don't realize is this piston, even though it looks like it's a perfect circle, is not. It's what's called an elastoval. So, because metal expands, and because along the wrist pin direction of the piston, there's more metal, this piston is going to expand more in this direction than it is in this direction. Because, as I said, there's more metal across the center here. It's not hollow. So this piston is actually, when it's cold, narrower at this, at this direction than it is this direction. So you need these pistons to heat up as quickly as possible, because if you don't, you've got basically an egg-shaped piston in a circular, perfectly circular bore in the engine block, and you get what's called piston slap. So if you've ever owned a third generation Jetta or Golf with the 2-liter engine, you've probably heard this before, because those engines were notorious for piston slap on cold start. You'd start it up and you could actually hear the pistons going slap, 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 slap. After a couple minutes of warming up, that would go away. The reason that was going away is because the piston was expanding to its full, correct, almost perfect circle shape. So it's running your engine with a cold start, like a cold start alarm on it, is not only bad for lubrication, but also you've got this piston beating up your cylinder bore. Okay? On top of that, I mentioned how the engine is running much more rich on cold start. So if you have an air-fuel ratio gauge, you might notice that your engine is running 10 or 11 to 1 air-to-fuel ratio, which means for every 10 parts air, you have 1 part fuel. Now, the proper stoichiometric air-fuel ratio, which means that the best for the catalytic converter and emissions, is 14.7 to 1. So with all that excess fuel, what happens is you can see there's piston rings on this piston. There's 3 rings. Each one has a gap. Now when you install them, you stagger the gap to try to prevent blow-by, which is this piston does not perfectly seal the cylinder. As the engine's running, there's air. It escapes past this first gap. It goes around, it finds the second gap, and it finds its way into the bottom end. Now the problem with that is when you're running extremely rich, that excess air with all the additional fuel in it can actually wash down your cylinder walls. So it can actually wash the oil off your cylinder walls, and that causes accelerated engine wear as well. And lastly, the last place that all goes is into your oil. So now, if you're sitting and idling your engine every day, what you have is gasoline blowing by these ring gaps and ending up in your engine oil. So now you have, every single morning when you start it up, you've got an engine that isn't getting enough oil between the bearings and the crankshaft. It's dumping an excessive amount of fuel that's leaking past these ringlands down into your oil and contaminating your oil, and gasoline is not a lubricant, so basically that's really bad for the metal on metal parts in your engine, like the camshafts that do touch, the lifters or the rocker arms. And then lastly, you've got an egg-shaped piston beating the hell out of a circular bore in your block. So now, instead of this 90% of engine wear happening very quickly, and then you're off and driving, your oil's up to temp and you're properly lubricating, your vehicle's sitting there in the driveway, and it's taking on a lot more wear of the engine than it really needs to be taking. Now, if the vehicle's under lease or you're not going to keep it 100,000 miles, maybe you won't ever see a problem with that. But if you're doing 10,000 mile oil changes that the dealer now recommends, which I'd like to say you don't want to be doing, even some dealers, once you're out of warranty, will start telling you to do your oil changes every 5,000 miles. But if you plan to keep this vehicle a couple 100,000 miles, you are most likely going to end up in a situation where you're going to have timing chain or guide wear if you've got timing chains. You can get camshaft wear. And camshaft wear and timing chain and guide wear is actually one of the more popular things that has started to resurface on these newer engines because they're running high pressure fuel pumps off the camshaft, which puts more force on it. And then, like I said, because of these 10,000 mile oil changes, a lot of these dealership cars are seeing a lot of timing chain and camshaft failure issues that the vehicles that are going to private shops that are not doing 10,000 mile oil intervals are not seeing. And so then that brings up with the question of, well, what can you do to heat your car up more quickly, especially if you're in a place like the Midwest or Alaska where you see these extreme temperatures and you might have kids. You don't want to put your infant child in a car that's negative 20 degrees or whatnot. And what I have here is a really great option for people that might be in that situation. So this is called a block heater or circulation tank heater. And what it does, and there's different versions that I'll talk about, but what this one does is you take one of your coolant hoses and you cut the hose and you install this in line, and then you plug it in. This is a water pump with a heater installed. So what it does is all throughout the night after you park your car, it circulates coolant through this heater and it heats it up so that when you get in the car in the morning, it probably won't be up to full operating temp, but it will at least be a lot closer. It will be to the point where your oil really never gets down to its winter weight. There are also other ones that you can get that just stick to the oil pan, and that directly heats your oil up. And then there's also ones that you can remove one of the freeze plugs where they empty out the sand from when they cast your block. It's a round plug. You can get ones that are installed into that and plug in. Now, unfortunately, if you live in an apartment or something like that and you don't have access to electricity, then really that's not going to be an option. But even still, really, the remote starts are not a good deal because somebody could easily steal your car from that point on. Secondly, most areas it's actually illegal to idle your vehicle, so you could end up in a situation where a cop rolls by and sees your car running and tickets you. So other than these options here, if you don't have electricity available and you say, well, I don't have electricity available, but I live in Minnesota or I live in Alaska and I'm just not going to put my 6-month-old in my car when it's negative 15 degrees, which I completely understand, then at worst case scenario, what you would want to do is go out to your car, start it up, and hold the accelerator pedal so that your RPM is about 2,000 or 2,500 RPM until the vehicle heats up. And it should heat up pretty quickly like that. That's basically the factory procedure that we're given as technicians when we need to do a repair to a vehicle and it needs to be to operating temperature. Rather than just sitting and letting it idle, you want to keep a high idle like that, and that'll warm it up pretty quickly so that you can then go back inside and get your children. You're not at risk of getting a ticket for idling unattended. You're not going to be at risk for your vehicle to get stolen because the immobilizer is defeated, and it's going to cause the least amount of engine wear to your vehicle while heating it up the most quickly and burning all those fuel and contaminants out of the oil while you're sitting there and doing it, so you don't end up with an oil that's saturated in gasoline that's actually, instead of lubricating, is just basically cleaning all the oil off of everything and causing an increased amount of engine wear. Anyways, so I hope you enjoyed the information contained in the podcast, and I hope it opened up some people's eyes and gave you some options to deal with cold weather vehicles. And thanks to CRP for sponsoring us and being a supporter of us for years. And I hope you enjoy this podcast, and those for years to come.